What are they doing here? I think that they're going to start building dirty bombs in our cities, and they're lying in wait for when the inevitable direct clash between Iran and the United States erupts, which I think is coming soon.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Grey, and this is Grey Matter.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Grey Matter. Well, Canada is the number one per capita importer of human beings in the world. The United States is second. And leading into the Christmas season, with the sort of renewal of hostilities over in Gaza, we had a surprising spike in things like anti-Semitism, which we had not seen in Canada or been aware of for a very long time. And this is also true of the United States. And as our viewers know, it's been very, very difficult to get reliable information and news about what's really going on there. And so we thought we'd have on our good friend Brandon Weichert, who is an expert in this area, a geopolitical analyst, who's written a fascinating book about Iran and about the Middle East. So he's very knowledgeable in this space, and we're very, very pleased and honored to have him back on the program. Welcome to the show, Brandon.
Thank you again for having me. It's a pleasure to be back here with my friends up north of us.
Yes. We really want to pick your brain about what's happening over there. We know you have deep insight about what's going on with the Houthis and Hamas and Iran and the connections there, and also how that's linked to the way things are being handled in the White House, which was recently attacked by some pro-Palestinian protesters. Right. Yes.
Looked like an insurrection to me.
So before we introduce you properly, we're going to go to our framing aphorisms briefly. The first one is from the late Reverend Billy Graham, who we know is very quotable. He once said that racial prejudice, anti-Semitism, or hatred of anyone with different beliefs has no place in the human mind or heart. I hope that I used to think we could all agree on that. Secondly, from the late Martin Luther King Jr., who was recently honored in the United States with an annual holiday, he wrote, "Make no mistake about those who call themselves anti-Zionist. They're also anti-Semitic." And finally, from an American commentator named Thomas Friedman, who said that criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic and saying so is vile, but singling out Israel for opprobrium and international sanction out of all proportion to any other party in the Middle East is anti-Semitic, and not saying so is dishonest. So who do we have on the show today? Well, Brandon Weichert. He is a geopolitical analyst who manages the Weichert Report, World News Done Right, and lives by Herman Cahn's credo, "I'm against fashionable thinking." He's the author of the 2020 book, Winning Space, How America Remains a Superpower. Also, a couple of other books that we're going to talk about today, including Biohack, China's Race to Control Life. But more importantly, what we want to talk about him today is a very fascinating book that he's written called Shadow War. Brandon has done a lot of research and has taken a real deep dive into the relationship between Iran, the state of Iran, the United States, and also the growing unrest and geopolitical instability in that part of the world. And so, Brandon, thanks again for coming on the program. I want to start with a bit of a funny that you'll appreciate. There's a recent story, the publication, that Donald Trump is actually more popular among Canadians than Justin Trudeau. So to be fair, Justin Trudeau is about as popular in Canada right now as herpes or gonorrhea. He's the least popular prime minister ever. But why do you think Donald Trump is so popular in Canada? I know you follow the Canadian polity pretty closly.
Yeah.
Do you have some ideas about that?
Yeah, well, I think actually, contrary to how he's presented in American media, Donald Trump's actually not a hardline right-wing guy. Donald Trump is a New York former liberal who's somewhat moderate on, I mean, we've seen in the campaign, he's somewhat moderate on gay marriage. He's somewhat moderate on, even abortion, while he supports, the Supreme Court's decision to end abortion. He's also worried about what it will do to women. These are not hardline conservative stances. My read on Canada is that it's always been sort of an even moderate country.
Right.
And I think compared to Justin Trudeau, who's basically a Marxist, I think Canadians are rightly looking down south saying, why can't we get that? I mean, yeah, his mean tweets may be a little too harsh for some Canadians, but ultimately, America had a strong economy under him, which of course benefited Canada.
Yes.
Donald Trump helped reinvigorate the not only Canadian American trade relationship, but also the Mexican American trade relationship with the USMCA, which replaced NAFTA. So there's a lot of not only sort of ancillary things to like about Trump, but there's also a lot of tangible benefits that Canada directly had. And also the United States military, which of course Canada is fused through NORAD with the United States defensive apparatus. We were the strongest we've been in decades under Trump. And of course, Biden has spent the last 3 years gutting it. And when I was out at one of our military bases in Washington State, which hosts a Canadian contingent, one of the commanders of the Canadian contingent told me that he feels that as America's military is being gutted by Biden, so is Canada's military being gutted by Trudeau. And so there's a lot of things to like about Trump. And I think that any reasonable person, while they may not like some of his sort of braggadocious behavior, I call him the Mad King, it's better than Mr. Magoo, which is what we're getting in Joe Biden, and certainly better than the wannabe Castro that is Justin Trudeau.
Yeah. Well, we have about as many reasonable people in our federal government in Ottawa as you have in the Biden administration. Unfortunately, the Canadian government, they were so worried, Brandon, about the ascendancy of Trump, because of course his success in Iowa and now New Hampshire, and of course everybody's beginning to see the writing on the wall that Mr. Trump is going to be the GOP candidate. They actually had meetings to decide, how are we going to deal with Mr. Trump? Now, on the other side of that, just to segue into the Middle East, I heard you say in a recent interview that you see Donald Trump as probably the best president in terms of Middle East for the United States and for the West since the 1950s. So
yeah.
Let's maybe segue in there. Maybe you could explain why you say that.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, there are elements in the Middle East that miss Donald Trump for this very reason, in the same way that Canadians are, surprisingly friendly to Trump or amenable to him. It's because Trump was very clear when it came to foreign policy, which is sort of ironic because if you remember, 2016, they were piling on him because he was a foreign policy naif. He didn't have any professional background, but I actually argue that's what gave him sort of an advantage because he wasn't locked into some of these preconceived paradigms that have dominated the foreign policy discourse, particularly on the Middle East, over the last 60 years. And so Donald Trump came in and he said, look, the Iran deal is the worst deal I've ever seen in my life. And I think he's probably right. It was one of the worst deals this country ever made. It was the equivalent of what Neville Chamberlain did with Hitler, only it was with nukes. Right. And Trump said at the same time, we got to kill these Islamist terror groups in the Sunni world. But at the same time, we don't want to replicate the George W. Bush agenda of basically invading 5 or 6 countries at a time in the Middle East. We can't afford it, and it doesn't work. So he said there's got to be a middle ground. There's got to be some way America can preserve its interests and protect itself in the region without abandoning it to its enemies. And that was the formulation behind the Abraham Accords, which was bringing Israel and the Sunni Arab states, notably the Saudis, together into sort of an anti-Iran coalition, a kind of a quasi-NATO of the Middle East that would contain and deter Iranian aggression. And it would allow for us to take a step back and to return back to the way we were in the Middle East pre-Desert Storm, which was as an offshore balancer. We were the force of last resort. Okay, let the region handle we'll support them, but let the region handle the day-to-day because they understand it better than we do. And that allows us to shift resources around background and focus on other threats like notably China. And so that was sort of Trump's third way approach, not the Obama appeasement, not the George W. Bush invade the whole region and get mired there for a century. And that was what we used to do when Harry Truman and Eisenhower were in office. That was sort of the traditional American role. And that's what we were returning to under Trump. And under Biden, it's been totally reversed. And we now see the fruits of that failed policy.
Mm-hmm. You wrote a book recently called The Shadow War, Iran's Quest for Supremacy. I remember we talked about this book the last time you were on here. And actually, although it was recently released, you wrote it a little while ago. And so you become a bit of a prophet here. You accurately predicted in your book some of the things that we're seeing right now, including the rise of anti-Semitism, which I've, like many people, I find very shocking and frankly vile. But you talk about in the book and also in some of your public discourse about the 3 H's, about what's going on in there. And this seems to be a very useful way to frame this discussion. Could you explain about what those 3 H's are?
Yeah. And so this was the product of a conversation with a dear friend of mine who has a radio show in Phoenix called Seth Leibson. But we were talking about this, and I said, when you think about it, it's the 3 H's. The Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. The 3 H's, those are the byproducts of Iranian terrorism, that they are all supported by Iran. They are not separate entities as they like to pretend to be. They are not sort of national liberation movements as they claim to be. They've all been co-opted by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the militant wing of the Iranian Islamic regime. And so what I said in the book, and I tracked this, is beginning especially in December 2016, there was a very famous meeting that was headed by the late General Qasem Soleimani of the IRGC, who Trump assassinated beautifully in 2019. But Soleimani headed a meeting. It was a terrorist convention, for lack of a better word, in which brought together Hezbollah and Hamas and also Fatah from the Palestinian territories. And they basically agreed to pull all the resources together, set aside whatever differences existed, and to pull their resources together to initiate an Iranian-led or an Iranian-orchestrated third intifada, what they said would be the final intifada against Israel. And the Houthis, while they weren't in that conference, the Houthis, we know, are directly trained, funded, and in some cases led by the IRGC. And so these 3 H's are sort of the steel claws of Iran that are extended across the region, and they're slashing hard. A Saudi official once said to me that Iran is a paper tiger with steel claws. And I add on in the book that those steel claws are the 3 H's: Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And if you want to throw in Fatah as well, you can, but then that sort of kills the paradigm with the H's. But that is exactly what we're seeing today. So what happened with Hamas and Israel on October 7th was not an isolated affair. The reason that attack happened when it did was a timing with perfect timing with geopolitical events. A few weeks before October 7th, Netanyahu went to the United Nations, held up a picture. It said the new map of the Middle East, and it detailed how Israel and Saudi Arabia were coming together in a security alliance, despite the fact that Biden was trying to kill that alliance. 3 weeks later, Hamas launches this attack. And what's one of the first things that happened as a result? Israel had to retaliate. And the moment Israeli bombs and troops start, hitting Palestinian Arabs in the Gaza Strip, the Arabs in Saudi Arabia are angry because they stand in solidarity with their co-religionists. And that puts the Saudi government, which is actually friendly to Israel and pro-American under Mohammed bin Salman's leadership, they have to kind of do this dance now where they want to help Israel, but they can't be seen as getting too close for fear of being overthrown. So that was a geopolitical win for Iran. And that is all the proof you need that Hamas is, in fact, one of the proxies of Iran, and that Iran is the hidden culprit here. It's not happening in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm. This is fascinating, and it sort of fits into the thesis of your book, which is that Iran has a quest for supremacy. And it's not limited just to Iran and the Middle East, is it? And part of it, and correct me if this is wrong, but we've seen in the United States, very heavy pro-Palestinian protesting, particularly even restricting access to Jewish neighborhoods. We've seen this in Great Britain. And in Canada, we've discovered recently that some of the protesters who have been out in full force in places like Toronto and Montreal and elsewhere are actually being paid. They're being paid by foreign NGOs to conduct these protests.
Mm-hmm.
And this is starting to become very serious and very violent. In fact, recently in Edmonton, which is the capital city of our province of Alberta, we had a gunman who came in and opened fire and set off an explosive device in City Hall in Edmonton. And he had an agenda. He had a manifesto which was connected to Palestine. So help us connect these dots. So you say in your book that Iran has a quest for supremacy, world supremacy, which is what they're talking about. And what we're seeing now in the West, them sort of branching out and causing civil disturbance and instability domestically, and really spreading fear and anti-Semitism. So how are these things connected?
So what we have found, and actually there's a guy, and I got to be careful because this was part of a closed meeting I was in a few nights ago, so I don't know how much of this I can share, but basically the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies has a kind of supposed protest movements in the West. And in the West, the media presents them as just, college kids trying to go out and, make their opposition to the quote unquote genocide Israel's perpetrating known. Well, it's much more than that. These are useful idiots. And in many cases, they're actually paid professional protesters of the kind that we see comprising BLM and Antifa's ranks.
Right.
And their whole job is to go out and to harass policymakers, ordinary people, to get them, to pressure them to change national policies as it relates to Israel. And to basically make Israel less safe. And that is all coming through proxies. It's all coming, though, from Iran and also China. And because Iran and China are working in tandem together right now. And so you have the outburst, the outgrowth of anti-Semitism, particularly among young people, is being fueled, whether they realize it or not, and funded and coordinated by Iranian intelligence assets. And so this is part of a coordinated strategy. This is part of sort of a fifth columnist strategy to kind of shape perceptions in Western nations. And then underneath that, you have an even darker agenda. Right now, the United States, as I'm sure you know, the United States has a massive border crisis on our southwestern border. And we know for a fact, I just talked to a former Border Patrol agent. We know for a fact that in the last month, dozens of Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps members have been apprehended crossing the border illegally. That there's Hezbollah elements crossing the border illegally and then disappearing into the United States. What are they doing here? Well, I think that they are lying in wait, planning for fifth columnist attacks on critical civilian infrastructure. In fact, I think they might actually be transporting uranium with them that Iran has because of their nuclear program. And I think that they're going to start building dirty bombs in our cities. And they're lying in wait for when the inevitable direct clash between Iran and the United States erupts, which I think is coming soon. And so, that's sort of the fifth column element here. You've got the perception shaping going on, perception management, and then you've got these covert kind of terrorists coming in. And meanwhile, our government, and I'm sure it's as bad also in Ottawa, but our government here is completely oblivious to it. And they're spending more time pressuring the Texas governor to stop enforcing the border rather than just trying to, solidify our security on the border. And this is all connected to Iran's wider quest for supremacy. They want to first achieve regional dominance. You remember, they're a Shiite Persian power in a predominantly Sunni Arab region. This goes back to the 7th century, the death of Muhammad, the Sunni Shiite split, right? Muhammad dies. Who's going to succeed him? That's the big fight. The Sunnis say it should be somebody appointed by a council of the wisest Muslims. The Shiites say no. Muhammad was a prophet and he has divine blood, and so it should be his successor should be a member of the family, a bloodline, a blood relative. And that was sort of the famous break between Sunni and Shiite. There are more Sunnis than there are Shiites, and so the Shiites have always been kind of an oppressed minority power in the region. And now today you add in the Jewish democracy, predominantly Jewish democracy of Israel. And now so Iran is now fighting two fronts against the so-called apostates in the Sunni Arab world and the American-backed Israelis. And then there's a larger issue here where the Islamists of Iran have labeled America as the great Satan because we are a Christian nation as well as a nation of unbelievers. We're sort of this weird mix. And so they want to basically use chaos, create as much chaos in the region so that our allies like the Sunnis, like the Saudis and Israel are weakened and pushed back, and the United States therefore is pushed over the horizon, giving Iran the window it needs to build its regional power and then expand from there, with China and Russia backing them the whole time.
Fascinating. Now, let's branch out into what's happening over there in the Middle East. We know that the United States has deployed some of its military resources there. They're present in the region.
Mm-hmm.
We've even heard about some, let's call them attacks or some flurries of military activity there, some flare-ups. What's actually happening over there? Because I can tell you in Canada, it's very, very difficult to get any news about what's actually happening in that region militarily. Do you have some insight in that regard?
Yeah, so what we're witnessing, there are a handful of special forces bases that we kept in place in Iraq even after we pulled out, as well as in Syria following the sort of semi-collapse of the Assad government. Basically, we're holding on to a region known as Deir ez-Zor, which is in eastern Syria. It's got a lot of oil interests, and U.S. Delta Force and Special Forces have been held up there since about 2016 or 17. And so, but the problem is that these bases, they're kind of like forward operating bases, so they're very tiny. They don't have a lot of defense. We can't really, continually support them because they're sort of isolated and they're kind of on their own, which means if there's a concerted effort by Iran and its allies to pressure those bases, attack them, there's a chance that we will get pushed out, which would be a huge coup for the Iranian regime, showing the great superpower losing these bases. Biden won't reinforce them. I don't even know if we should, because they're very hard to defend. It would require us to escalate in such a way where we basically would be bogged down in another Middle East war. So what I've been saying for the last few years is to say, hey, we should reposition those guys out of those regions and then just tell the Iranians, if you guys start, using those supply networks to link up with Hezbollah, we're just going to start bombing them in Iraq and Syria from the air. We don't really need a lot of guys on the ground for that. But until that happens, Biden's kept those forces in these vulnerable positions. He won't really help defend them, yet he won't pull them out. So it's giving Iran, a lot of, prestige by attacking us, showing us to be the apparent weaker horse despite being a superpower. The Houthis are doing something similar. These missile attacks they're doing and these harassment of international shipping, and the fact that the United States is sort of slow to respond only adds to the notion in the minds of many people in the region that America is a weak and incompetent power. And that is the worst combination of things to be seen as in that part of the world, because it makes everybody else think America has no staying power, and therefore they should just kind of align with Iran either directly or indirectly, because Iran is the new power. It's going to be their region anyway.
And meanwhile, this is all sort of being propped up by international organizations as well. Now, I want to tie that in with the ascendancy of Donald Trump. You talked a little bit about him earlier, about why he was a good president in terms of maintaining stability and maybe preventing unrest, military unrest in the UN. Now, bearing in mind what you say about the UN, how are things going to change if Donald Trump is restored to the White House, come January of 25? Is he going to change the complexion of the UN and America's role in it, based upon what you said, that it's an American construct, with which I happen to agree? What's your take on that?
Well, the first thing I should let your audience know is I do not have anything to do with the campaign. I'm just a supporter now.
Sure.
I was actually very, very critical of the former president over the last year with things that happened in his final year in office, but I am supporting him. And I do think he did a lot of things right. But when he was president, he could have really negated America's role in the UN, and he chose not to do that. I don't think he would do that again. I was sort of just, spitballing my opinion on that. But I don't think he's going to pull us out of the UN. But I do think he's more skeptical, and I think he's got a healthy skepticism of these international organizations. I mean, we've
Mm-hmm.
seen how the WHO, we've seen how the WTO, we've seen how all these international organizations that were designed normally by Americans at the end of the Second World War to augment our power have been hijacked, notably by China, and have been actually weaponized against the United States and its allies. I mean, we see this most prevalent with the Israelis, where the UN is constantly going after Israel, which it shouldn't be, because, okay, maybe Israel does human rights violations sometimes, but that's no more than what the Chinese do or what the Iranians are doing. And yet the Iranians are, again, I think, on their 10th time as the Human Rights Council president. They're serving as the head of the Human Rights Council at the UN. So what I was getting at in that tweet really was that we really need to really slow down our support for the UN, because it doesn't help us anymore. It used to in the Cold War, you could say, although there's still an argument to say that it wasn't, but now it has really become an anti-American construct that we're funding. And so in my opinion, the upside of Trump, not necessarily he's going to pull us out, but I do think he's going to be a little bit more skeptical of the UN. He's also, as we know, very skeptical of NATO. And I think that actually we need to have that discussion, because a lot of these international organizations that China's using against us now were created to fight the Cold War. The Cold War's over, and whatever kind of conflict we're entering into now is going to be fundamentally different from what the Cold War was. And so we need new constructs.
Speaking of new construct, I really want to get your take on the new Argentinian president's recent address to the World Economic Forum. He was quoted as saying recently that socialism is a violent, murderous, and impoverishing phenomenon. And in my research on you, that's an opinion that I know that you share. You're no fan, particularly of Leninism. But, he gave this address recently at the World Economic Forum, in which he essentially said to those people, look, you guys think that you are the solution. In fact, you're not. You are the root of the problem. Collectivism leads to scarcity, poverty, human suffering, and ultimately to death. And he says, the Argentinian people, because of our history, we understand, because we were one of the richest countries in the world, let's say 150 years ago, and now we went down the wrong path. And he's saying, look, we're going back to freedom. We're getting back to basics. We're basically enunciating the principles that were in the American Declaration of Independence. He didn't say that. I'm saying that. Do you see this as an important shift in terms of geopolitics, that Argentina, that somebody would go to the World Economic Forum, the world leader, to basically tell them off?
Right. Well, I thought it was interesting also that Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, did something similar as well. I was surprised that he was even brought in. And actually, you have Yuval Harari, who's a nutty globalist. He's saying, he thinks, I tweeted this morning, he thinks that Donald Trump is going to win, and that's basically going to be the end of globalism. And so, you now have, I think, globalists realizing that the consensus isn't actually there, that people are aware of what they're trying to do, and there's pushback. And it's now so prevalent that you have world leaders basically giving the bird to the WEF to their faces, going to the WEF forum and basically telling them, you're useless and we don't want you. The issue is Milei is, just as Bolsonaro is sort of the lone voice of reason in Latin America. And my fear is that there has been a coordinated campaign directed against populist right-wing leaders. You saw the unfair removal of Bolsonaro from Brazil. You've seen the collapse of the right-wing government in Colombia. You've seen the rise or the resurgence of Marxism again in Latin America, except for in Argentina. You've seen the assassination of Shinzo Abe in Japan, who most certainly would have been the prime minister again if he had lived. You see the pressure campaign mounted against Narendra Modi in India. You see the lawfare being deployed against Netanyahu in Israel. You see also Boris Johnson, what happened with him, and also what happened with Donald Trump in 2020, well, his entire presidency. Right. So you see, these right-wing leaders around the world being pushed out. And my concern with Milei is that he's the only guy down there, and it will be easy for them to push him out, because we've seen already with Bolsonaro and the Colombian government that it was easy for for the forces of the left to use really undemocratic means to push out these leaders. So I hope that Milei can prove me wrong, and I hope he keeps going, because he's a breath of fresh air. But he is a symbol that there is a real pushback among the people of the world to globalism, and I think the globalists are realizing it, and they're getting scared.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with that, and you talk about the globalist agenda very much in one of your other books called Biohack: China's Race to Control Life. Yes. And how the COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccines tie into that. Bearing in mind what you say in that book, and also what you talk about in Shadow War, do you think that a crisis like a full-blown military conflict can be averted? And that is, do you think globalism as a concept and its obvious, I guess, dominance that we've experienced over the past few years, do you think that can be changed by, for example, regime changes in places like the United States or God be praised, Canada? Do you think that could have the desired effect, or do you think it's going to take some level of military conflict before we can resolve this whole globalist issue?
Well, I also think the WEF in particular, contrary to what they think, has been co-opted by the Chinese government.
Really?
I think all of these globalist institutions, they don't even realize that they're useful idiots. Everybody thinks that they're the evil villains. I actually think it's the other way around. I think they are being co-opted without them realizing it by the Chinese government to basically use unconventional warfare to break apart Western resistance without ever China having to fire a shot. That's my pet theory. As it relates to Western governments shifting right, I do think that if Trump can get reelected, and that's a big if he can win again, I think that it does a serious blow to the globalists. And I think that's why they're panicking. And I think that's why you're seeing all of these globalist allies in Western governments getting really crazy with sort of these totalitarian moves, because it's a use it or lose it mentality. And so I do think that the right kind of leaders getting elected in these countries can really bust apart the globalist plans for dominion. At the same time, I also think we are teetering on the brink of a major war. The only upside to major wars is that sort of the fat is cut from governments. Think about the pre-war American government, its military leadership. Most of those guys, because of Pearl Harbor, were shanghaied out of power, and we got guys like Chester Nimitz and George Patton elevated, who really reinvigorated our military culture, and then ultimately our political culture. Was we got great presidents. We got a handful of great presidents out of that sort of end of the war type, everything was sort of shaken up. So I think that you have two forces at play here that could shake up our system greatly and have a long-term benefit. My hope is that the right-wing leadership can do enough change that we won't have a world war, because I do think that if the left, particularly if Biden remains in power, I think that we will be in a world war in his second term. I think that's where this is headed. I think Trump can avert that.
So you talk about a Biden second term, and I realize you're not a political prognosticator, but do you expect that Joe Biden is going to be the Democrat nominee for the presidency? We're going to see a rematch of 2020, because there is talk of people like Gavin Newsom, who's sort of Justin Trudeau's alter ego in the United States. Two guys with the same personality, or we've even hearing about Michelle Obama being the Democrat nominee. Do you think it's going to be Biden again?
I think that probably, but I did write a column, several, over last summer at 1945.com, in which I was outlining how and why Michelle Obama would run. And I think that there is a very high degree of probability that she does run, and I think she'd put Gavin Newsom as her vice president. So I think that the problem is Michelle would really be the only way that the Democrats have a real shot in a fair election of winning, because she's not only a woman of color, but she's very popular with people. And Trump is a maniac when he debates. And the problem is when he gives the Trump treatment to Michelle Obama, a recent popular, unlike Hillary Clinton, who was not popular, a recent popular first lady, that actually could backfire on Trump. giving her the Trump treatment in a debate, and that actually might engender sympathy for Michelle Obama. So Michelle Obama is one of the ones that keeps me up at night, the thought of her campaign. Even though I think she's very thin-skinned, the problem is it would be the optics of Trump bullying a former first lady who's very popular, and she's got people around her, many of the same people with Biden and with her husband, that really scare me if they get more power.
Well, that's that thought scares me too.
Right.
So I know that you have to go. We're grateful for your time, Brandon. But before we go, I want to just review our reading list. The two books of yours that we talked about today. One is called Shadow War: Iran's Quest for Supremacy. And I've read this book, folks. It's brilliant. I really enjoyed it. It gave me a whole new insights into some of the particulars that Brandon has talked about today on the show. And also his other book, Biohacked, China's Race to Control Life, which we talked about in more detail on a previous episode of our show. So I would invite you to go back and maybe review that one. But both of these books are available for purchase at Amazon, anywhere you buy books. I'm waiting, Brandon, for the audio versions. I'd love to hear you.
Me too. We're trying to get the publishers to do it, but there's a licensing thing, and it's the business thing. But yes, I am ready and willing to get those out ASAP.
Yeah, I'd love to hear you. I really enjoy when authors narrate their own books. It gives a whole new flavor, sort of appreciation to the author's work. Now, to close off the show, are there any other books of yours or other things that you've recently read that you'd recommend to the people watching this and listening to it?
Well, I'm working on my next book, which will be coming out around election time here in the United States. It's right now called The Disaster of Our Own Making, How NATO Expansion Doomed Ukraine. And so because of that, I have gotten to read a lot of interesting research. There's one in particular, Orlando, and I can never say his last name right, Figes, Figes, called The Story of Russia. It's a very readable history, and it's just very wild, all of the complexities of Russia. I've also read Michael Caputo's book, The Ukraine Hoax, which is all about sort of what Ukraine did to Trump in the 2016 election in supporting Hillary Clinton. Those are sort of the two books I would recommend to your audience right now, because I've kind of been in Russia-Ukraine world for the last year researching this book. And those are two of the most readable, interesting books. And I know Michael Caputo as well. He's a friend. So I'm a big fan of his. He's got some really interesting insights.
Yeah, well, speaking as a Canadian whose country has donated $10 billion to the failing Ukrainian state there, I'd be very interested to read your new book. I'm looking forward to it. When do you expect when do you expect to release that?
Well, the editing process begins February 12th, and then they're trying to have it out by October, November of this year for the election. But I can get you an early copy once it's all finalized.
Oh, I'd be so grateful.
Kurt Mills of the American Conservative is going to be writing the foreword, and Sumatra Mitra and some really great foreign policy thinkers on the new right are giving me blurbs. So it's got the endorsement of a lot of really cool people.
Wonderful. So, well, thank you so much for being our guest again.
Thank you for having me.
Brandon, really enjoy listening to you and your keen insights into
same here.
Geopolitical affairs. And please keep writing. We enjoy your books very much. And all the best to you and your family. God bless you. Thanks, Brandon.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing it.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.